Explained by the Meier contacts, mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Noah and Noah's Ark Genesis Flood Narrative. See also Floods Ask Its Explanations Part 4.
But it still has to be explained that the erroneous assumptions of all of the earth scientists about the time of the Ark deluge are just as very wrong, by umpteen thousands of years, as are the erroneous calculations to which they have succumbed about the times of various kings and emperors who lived thousands of years ago. The actual time, which was handed down to you, earthlings, of the deluge of the Ark, is also greatly falsified because it occurred nearly 100,000 years ago and therefore must be calculated to be very much earlier than the lifetime of King Seleuc, who had taken over an important role in regard to the pyramids.
Contact Report 005.
Many researchers of the Earth have been trying since ever to calculate the exact time of the flood known to you through the Bible, but so far without any noteworthy success. Indeed, according to today's Christian calendar, the flood took place exactly 10,079 years ago. It was triggered by a worldwide catastrophe of cosmic origin when a gigantic comet threw the Earth out of its orbit and changed its period and direction of rotation. At that time, one Earth day amounted to more than 40 hours, and the sun didn't rise in the east like it does today. Such changes in rotation time and direction of rotation have afflicted the Earth 2 more times after the flood, but they have not brought such devastating catastrophes as with the mentioned flood. The last radical change of this kind took place 3,500 years ago, of which, however, I will still speak later. The flood 10,079 years ago, related to the year 1975, was caused by a gigantic comet, which has already caused a lot of damage and has been traversing the universe since time immemorial. We call it the Destroyer, and we know that it has already been racing through outer space for millions of years. 10,079 years ago, this giant comet, which had originated from a natural cosmic catastrophe, got very close to the realm of the Earth and almost destroyed it. Only the knowledge and ability of our ancestors, who had settled on the Earth and had begotten their descendants here, prevented the terrible end.
Contact Report 039.
Then these Mount Shasta interior inhabitants would, indeed, be the descendants or distant descendants of those Hyperboreans who, 180,000 or 190,000 years ago, carried out the actual decolonization in the form that can be regarded then as the early history of the current human race, at least for the white race. Among them then must have also been the Ishwish who gave Enoch great wisdom. Methuselah went to this one in a later incarnation of Enoch, and Noah was later commissioned by this one's guardian angels to build that ark with which he actually landed then on Ararat.
Sure, except that the event, with the building of the ark, which Noah himself did not build, and with his family and with the animals and everything else, became so falsified that no current information agrees with the truth anymore. The events with the ark did truly take place, but at another time, 90,000 years later.
I know that very well, and in these falsified assertions, the boundless stupidity and lack of education of the scribes inevitably comes to full expression. For how else could they have written in their fantasy story that Ararat is the highest mountain in the world? And on the other hand, how, for example, could elephants as well as mammoths, which were still there at that time, rhinoceroses and all other four-legged animals, etc., have climbed down from Ararat? I happen to know the mountain very well, and know that even a good mountain climber has lots of distress and trouble when wanting to conquer the mountain.
Contact Report 061.
Can you tell me when the last great flood took place? Because there were several of them. So I'm not talking about the one pertaining to Noah or Noah's flood.
As you wish. It is now about 10,080 years since then.
This deluge, was it the only one in those 10 through 80 years?
No. There were not only those which you mistakenly call the Great Biblical Flood, which truly took place about 100,000 years ago, because two other somewhat smaller floods came later, once in 7957 and another time in 6906. However, none of them have anything to do with the Noah's flood, as you call it, although in this respect, it is also falsely claimed that it was the biblical flood, especially the one to be dated. Between the time of 7,000 and 8,000, there were also huge floods in the Near East and Asia, in Turkey and Persia, etc., and these floods, of which there were two, were equal to small floods. There were also great floods about 96,000 and 100,000 years ago. The biblical flood did not take place 10,000 to 80 years ago, but took place much earlier and was triggered by the destroyer. By extremely coarse inaccuracies and corrections for the Bible, etc., these events were distorted and falsified by the old chroniclers, and thus Bible researchers and antiquity researchers chronologically set them much later and extremely erroneously. After these events about 10,000 years ago, it took only about 135 years before the Earth was again afflicted by a catastrophe, bigger and more gigantic than the two before, but in today's eastern area of the Earth ball, which was flooded by enormous masses of water when the giant comet Destroyer passed the Earth in dangerous proximity, 10,080 years from now calculated back. This led to worldwide catastrophes, which, however, for reasons beyond our understanding, were never recorded by the earthly chroniclers and only found their expression in writings much later when another flood, again caused by the destroyer, afflicted the earth, namely 7,957 years ago. For about 1,000 years, the Earth was spared from major catastrophes until the year 6906, before 1976, when the destroyer once again caused enormous devastation on the Earth and destroyed many things.
Contact Report 069.
Well then, is it also correct that Noah was around 3.10 meters tall, while Adam actually measured around 5 meters?
Sure, only Adam was less than 5 meters tall. He was still a little more than a meter shorter than that measure.
Contact Report 248.
Now, I once again have something concerning the Bible, and, specifically with regard to the so-called Noah's Ark, which was actually built at one time, however, at a completely different time than what is claimed in the Bible. The biblical flood did not happen at the time claimed by the Bible, but in the year 4613 BC and was brought about by the destroyer. Quetzal made the following statement: 4613 BC, destroyer falls into the Earth's orbit, which disturbs the Earth in its rotation and in its revolution around the Sun, triggering immense earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and elementary storms, and from the whole event, the biblical flood arises. The rotation of the Earth is changed, and a polar shift takes place. The biblical flood, therefore, conforms with reality, even though it has been placed in another time by chroniclers, as this also applies to the fabrication and the events surrounding Noah's Ark. This was actually built around 98,400 years earlier and hence around 100,000 years ago, calculated back from today. Is that true?
That is right, but from what source does your knowledge stem?
From Quetzal, of course. At one time, I was together with him on Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey, respectively on the Russian-Turkish-Iranian border, and, indeed, because I was interested in the history of the Ark. There, he explained to me these very things. The Ark landed around 100,000 years ago, and not on the peak of the 5,165-meter-high Ararat, but around 30 kilometers away, and not at the height of a summit. The size of the Ark also corresponds to the one given in the Bible. With this, the many animals and only a few human beings had really survived an earlier flood that, like the biblical flood, was brought about by a pole shift.
That is not correct, for it was a colossal tidal wave that was caused by a large comet that nearly collided with the Earth and caused enormous catastrophes, including the gigantic tidal wave through which the Ark was lifted high onto Mount Ararat.
Pardon me, then I probably mixed up the two events.
That must be so.
Thanks for your correction. Now, Noah did not live at the time of the events with the Ark, and neither did his family. Nevertheless, the event happened amazingly close to what the Bible reports. It's just that the builder was a man named Noah, Shah, man of peace, and he maintained contact with an extraterrestrial named Zebulon. He who brings the hosts of the universe, who explained the approaching danger of the comet to him and advised him to build the Ark, which he then did in collaboration with his family and hence survived the immense flood, along with his family and with many domestic and land animals. These factual events have been handed down since approximately 98,000 years ago by word of mouth again and again, whereby the name Noah was gradually altered and fell into oblivion and finally ended in the name of Noah, while the extraterrestrial, who was in contact with Noah, was renamed and became elevated to a god. After the biblical flood, the actual Bible Ark Noah history was then created, whereby the true origin of the events ultimately became lost.
That is what is also recorded in our chronicle with regard to the important events on the earth. Your explanation is therefore correct.
It is simply astonishing, so I think, that in spite of the later biblical falsification, the history of the Ark has been so well preserved for more than about 100,000 years, when one just considers that during that time, very few people lived on the whole earth. Do you, perhaps, know the number of people who lived at the time of the comet catastrophe and the number of people who died?
There exists with us no precise data about this, but only estimates. These say that prior to the massive tidal wave, approximately 870,000 people lived on that part of the earth, but as a result of the catastrophe, about 650,000 lost their lives. Out of the surviving 220,000, about 140 people lived on the Ark, who, after the time of the flood, then settled the land again in the Middle East, where many foreigners then also immigrated. This total of about 220,000 people had it very hard because for many thousands of years, they were decimated again and again by epidemics and all sorts of other disasters. Therefore, they could only multiply very slowly at first, and only reached a total population of 11 million people about 10,000 years ago, distributed across the whole Earth, of course.
Contact Report 249.
Now a question about the Noandakan, known to us as Noah. During our last conversation we also talked about him, but under the name Noankadnosser. Are they two different people, or are they one and the same person? If so, why do you use two different names?
It is the same man who is called Noah on Earth. But Noah is only the short name of Noandakan or Noankadnosser. Noandakan is a name that goes back to the ancient lyric language and was used by the ancient Lyrans on Earth, while the name Noankadnosser was coined and used by the Earth people. So when we talk about Noah or Noandakan and Noankadnosser in this way, we are always talking about the same name, which by the way means man of rest.
From which earthly language then does the name Noankadnosser originate?
The language died out about 80,000 years ago. The name for it was Centilin.
Contact Report 492.
Earlier, when it was, I do not remember. I was told that the ship known as Noah's Ark was roughly equivalent to the masses, as written in the Bible, for example. Could you perhaps tell me a little more precisely what the Ark looked like? A ship at that time.
You must not make a comparison between the forms of ships in use today and the Ark, because the Ark had no similarity with the forms in use today and also in ancient times. The information given in the Bible is wrong, which mentions 300 cubits length and 50 cubits width and 30 cubits height. The ark was a large round structure, in the middle of which there was a building structure which took up about 1/6 of the total length, respectively the diameter of the ship. The width of the ship is therefore wrongly handed down, because the diameter of the ship was uniform, because it was round, while the wrongly handed down measurements of the width concerned the building amidships. The ship was surrounded all around by a high wall, which is handed down as height. In the area where the ark was built, there were large forests at that time. What has been put into the Bible regarding the ark legend goes back to old Mesopotamian and Sumerian legends, which date back to a flood that happened about 100,000 years ago and tell the story of a man named Noankad-Nosser and his family who was in contact with extraterrestrials and survived the flood with his family and a small number of animals in an ark. So the legend has not in any way anything to do with the biblical story, because the legend is based on a looted property that goes back to the ancient peoples of Mesopotamia and Sumeria and their ancient sagas and legends.
Yeah, I remember what you told me about that. Somewhere there was the four-stream land, with the so-called Garden of Eden, which was also stolen from the Mesopotamian and Sumerian legends and put into the Bible. The four-stream country was so called because the Euphrates, the Tigris, and the rivers Pirot and Gihon, or whatever they were called, flowed through it. The four rivers flowed there somewhere into a delta, but today the Persian Gulf, respectively the Arabian Gulf, as it is also called, exists there. But as of today, in the year 2010, it was first created about 8,000 years ago by a tremendous natural catastrophe, in which, as in the case of the various other floods, tremendous wild waters surged for thousands of years, and even for more than 100,000 years. The term Sint has nothing to do with sin, as this was reinterpreted by the influence of the Church, but was reinterpreted again in the 20th century. You once explained to me that Sint in an old pre-Germanic language meant as much as mighty, whereby in connection with the old term Vluot, respectively flood, Sintfluot, respectively Sintflut, a mighty flood, had been created.
Contact Report 799.
Lies spread in religions, such as in the three of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in the so-called religious books Torah, Bible, and Quran, which could not be more hair-raising and lead back to Babylonian origins. For example, the so-called flood was nothing more than a wild water, or a flood or high water as a result of a storm. This had an easy time in Babylonia at that time, because the water architects had large watercourses built by the cities, whereby the rising wild waters could quickly burst their banks and cause floods. The Babylonians called such floods deluge, which the Jewish peoples had simply adopted in the same way when they were brought into captivity to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, and established the term deluge, with world flood and the like. There they had also heard of the fantasy story of the flood and the fable of Noah's Ark, which was also written down in cuneiform by a scribe in Ur, although the name of the alleged ark builder was renamed, as moreover the necessary material for the construction did not actually grow in Ur, today's Basra, but in the south of India. Moreover, it must also be said that ancient cuneiform writings dating from the early primeval times of Babylonia state that this ark was supposed to be around 70 meters in diameter, which at that time was an impossibility to build such a thing, and to seal it with bitumen in such a way that it would have been waterproof. Not to mention how it would have been possible with a round boat, which, by the way, are still in use today in certain areas of Iraq and measure about 1.5 to 3 meters, which, according to an ancient cuneiform inscription, would have had a diameter of just about 70 meters, to take a pair of each animal species on board, since there are known to be millions of different species of animals, creatures, and other living beings. At that time, many more than today, because in the meantime, the human beings have already exterminated many of them. Nevertheless, all these Babylonian stories were taken over by the Jewish peoples, who were very strongly influenced by the Babylonian beliefs and integrated much into their own religion, which was later also adopted in the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran.
Contact Report 834.
The so-called flood, which did not come about from a primordial rain, but had its original cause in the melting of huge glacial areas and parts of the North Pole, which caused the waters of the seas and certain lakes to rise, and caused floods of the rivers Tigris and Euphrates and the Black Sea, etc. at that time.
The Black Sea was actually a huge freshwater lake, but this slowly began to change about 10,000 years ago, before the giant lake, the Black Sea, became salty due to the intrusion of seawater. Today, however, the Black Sea is called the sea because of its size. Actually, this sea was already as big 18,000 years ago as it still is today, but it consisted of fresh water, which then swelled as a result of the melting of the glaciers and drove the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, etc., to such wild waters that everything was flooded and destroyed, from which the story of the flood was then concocted. That is actually what really happened, and in a slightly different way than one has to tell it so that it is also understood. This also regarding the ark and the animals and so on.
That is indeed the case. And besides, the event took place much earlier and completely differently than is generally claimed and written about in the Bible, etc. Already all the cuneiform writings and the like correspond to false representations of the origin and the events. As I have seen for myself, the ark, for example, was a very large and round water vessel, which bore no resemblance whatsoever to known ship forms, as these were formed much later, and as these are still in use today. The animals and birds, etc., that were housed in the very large and round ark were only those that were needed on their own land to be worked, as well as much fodder and food, as well as enough water for all the livestock and for the human beings had to be stored in the ark.
I know all that because Svath, your father, let me see it all. The so-called ark was about 70 meters tall, 68 meters to be exact, if I remember correctly. For those days, it was truly a huge thing, which moreover not only took several months to build, but was also built by Noah because he was warned that floods were coming, namely by the waters in the Black Sea rising, and in the near future overflowing the rivers, and tremendous floods would inundate the whole country very high. Moreover, the man who built the so-called ark with the help of all his family and friends was not called Noah, but Noah.
I am aware of that because I met the man,